Good evening and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I'm going to do a full ability breakdown of Symbiote Supreme. I'm going to have to do this one a little bit differently. His abilities are very interwoven, so I'm going to attack it segment by segment, but I'm going to start with synergies. So if you don't care about the synergies, which you really don't need to care about them that much, you can skip to the ability breakdown and tips and tricks going forward. So first off, let me touch on the synergies. So first we have this synergy here with Dormammu and Mephisto, which is special to effects trigger through blocks, which is nice if you make a mistake because you still get the benefits of the special 2, but for the most part you really don't need that. It just kind of potentially comes up in rare instances, but I wouldn't really think about it too much because you probably won't be bringing it. Mystic Masters, begin the fight with 1 bar of power. This is probably one of the more useful synergies, especially if you're trying to use Symbiote Supreme as a taxi for some reason, which you generally won't. He's more of a boss killer, but if you are, then this will help you ramp up a lot quicker, since Symbiote Supreme is generally seen as a race to a special 3 champion, and then proceed to annihilate your opponent from there. So this will help in the form of taxi use, but you are sacrificing, you're getting Mordo or Doctor Strange, not exactly the ideal questing team. This next one is probably one of the more useful as well, because you could bring Venom the Duck, Venom Carnage, and those are 3 great champions to have on your roster. Each time a stagger's duration expires, it has a 25% chance to reapply itself. In Symbiote Supreme, a lot of his kit revolves around staggering and reapplying staggers over and over again, so this is a really neat synergy. This is plus Nullify and Fate Seal resistance, which is virtually useless. This one only affects Spider-Gwen, this one only affects Doctor Doom, and this one is plus 1% attack for each stagger on the opponent, which is, it's garbage. Just don't use it. So at that said, let me jump straight into the ability breakdown, and I want to just get past his awakened ability first. So his awakened ability is on a time duration. You get a guaranteed stagger passive effect on the opponent, and stagger nullifies any buff that's triggered. This is really useful, but not at all necessary. I have a 6-star rank 2, and that's unawakened, and I was confident rank 2ing him instead of like doing a rank 5 5-star, because yes, this awakened ability is going to provide you a little bit of guaranteed stagger as well as some more general consistency, but for the most part you can apply plenty of staggers without this. This awakened ability really comes into play when you need a guaranteed stagger, such as like when you're using Symbiote Supreme to combat rage nodes or long fights where maybe you just have a bad spree of luck, but for the most part this really doesn't come into play and you don't really need it. But I just wanted to talk about it because, hey, if he is awakened, it's nice to have, but I wouldn't bring him past Sig 60 or so, because you really don't need any more than that, and even then Sig 1 is Sig 1 to Sig 40 is probably enough. So that said, I can't just like scroll through this and read his abilities because it's a lot more complicated than that. So I'll scroll through and I'll try to make sure I touch on everything, but the generic start off here is that Symbiote Supreme does not gain power from attacking, blocking, or being struck. He has 100% reduced power gain from those, which is kind of tricky. That said, he gains 16.5, or essentially 1/6 of his maximum power every 9 seconds. His other means of generating power is through genetic blessings, which is every 15 seconds he changes phases. So he has 3 blessings that he cycles through, and if you have genetic potential consumed, you gain up to 100% of a bar of power. Now the exact phrasing on this is each time a blessing triggers, 100% of genetic power is consumed to gain up to 100% of bar power. And you might read that and think, oh, I have to consume 100% genetic potential in order to gain bar of power. But what it really means, because like the exact phrasing is that 100% of the genetic potential Symbiote Supreme has stored up is consumed, and you gain up to 100% of a bar of power. And it is worth noting that genetic potential is stacked up in forms of 25, 50, 75, and 100 at max. So you can get anywhere from 25, a quarter, half, 3/4, or a full bar of power every 15 seconds when you change phases. Now, Symbiote Supreme builds genetic potential every time you nullify a buff, or a stagger effect falls off a champion. Every time you nullify a buff with a stagger, you gain additional genetic potential. So against champions that don't have buffs, just every time a stagger falls off, you get additional genetic potential. And every time you're fighting an opponent with buffs, every time the buff is removed, you get significantly more genetic potential. So he's still useful against non-buffed champions, but you're going to feel the ramp up a lot quicker against buff champions, and that's really what he's used for, is an anti-buff champion fight, plus especially like reliant on bleeds and armor breaks for heavy damage. So champions that are like armor break immune or bleed immune, you're going to lose some damage, but the value is still there in the fact that you're not having to deal with any kind of annoying buffs because of the persistent stagger. So that said, Symbiote Supreme cycles through 3 phases. I'm going to call them phases, but the technical term is blessings. And those 3 blessings are Cthulhu's Cunning, Null's Shadow, and Set's Fangs. But I refer to them as Power, Shield, and Sword. Yes, the technical terms are way cooler sounding, but Power, Shield, and Sword makes it a lot easier to remember what they do. So Power phase is the phase you will start every single fight in. And at the beginning of every single fight, you have a 100% chance when this blessing is triggered to immediately nullify all buffs on the opponent. So essentially, every time you switch into the Power phase, which will happen either every time you special 3 or essentially 45 seconds into the fight if you never special 3, every single buff on your opponent has a 100% chance to be immediately nullified. But this also means that at the start of every fight, any buffs your opponent would start with are immediately nullified as well. So this works particularly well against people that start the fight unstoppable or start the fight with power gain, regen, etc., because they immediately are nullified. You'll get that power if you have Mystic Dispersion, as well as start the fight with some genetic potential. And it's a really, really good time, so just be mindful that you're fighting like an unstoppable Colossus or something. You can go for like that parry immediately into a combo. Additionally, Symbiote Supreme does a good amount of direct damage to the opponent for each buff nullified while in this phase, increased based on the quantity of genetic potential he has, and you have a 5% chance to place a stagger on the opponent every time you land a basic attack, and you have a 50% chance to land a stagger every time you crit. So while you are in power phase, you want to be pummeling the opponent as much as possible to land as many staggers as possible, and knowing that every time you nullify a buff, you're going to get a good amount of damage. So after 15 seconds, you're going to move into Null's Shadow or Shield phase. So at the beginning of Shield phase, you will gain a protection buff which lasts for 10 seconds. And it's important to note that the blessing phase duration is 15 seconds and this protection phase is only 10. So in the last 5 seconds of Shield phase, you're actually not protected. So don't pay attention to the blessing so much as there is a separate icon denoting that you have a protection. And I'll show you that, when I show the clip at the end of this. So while you have this protection buff, you will only take 15% of your max health in a hit. So essentially, if you tank a special 3, you'll only take 15% of your health. And if the opponent has an active buff, if for some reason you haven't staggered them, or like a lot of the reasons for why someone might like push into a special 3 when you're playing Symbiote Supreme is if like maybe you accidentally trigger Spite. They have that Spite active, that counts as a buff, so you're actually only going to take 7.5% of your damage instead. So if for some reason you're taking a buffed hit, you're actually taking even less damage, which makes Symbiote Supreme all that more of a counter and a nice little safety net to have. It's also one of the reasons why he's so good for Alliance War. While in this phase, you will also have a 15% chance to place a stagger passive on the opponent lasting 10 seconds and well-timed blocks. That 15% chance is every time you're struck or you block an opponent, but well-timed blocks increase the chance to 50%. And it's important to note that this was originally saying 100%, but Kabam did come out and say that Symbiote Supreme was bugged. It was only triggering 50%, and based on the power level of the champion, they decided to change the text rather than fix the bug. It frustrated a lot of players, but he's still absolutely crazy. So in this phase, you just want to do perfect blocks in order to build as many staggers as possible, but essentially, just parry attack. Maybe just switch to like a parry double medium combo if you're really trying to build up staggers, but for the most part, you shouldn't have to worry about it as long as you're in the right matchups. Next up, in Sword phase or Set Fangs phase, you have a 100% chance when this blessing is triggered to gain a Fury buff, free damage, again for 10 seconds. You have a 100% chance to cause a bleed buff on every hit, dealing damage based on genetic potential and lasting 8 seconds. It's important to note that if you have 0 genetic potential, you're not going to get a bleed debuff, because even if you did get a bleed debuff, it would deal literally 0 damage, because again, the damage of your bleed debuff is determined by how much genetic potential you have. So if you're like, oh, I'm in sword phase but I'm not getting bleeds, it's either because the opponent is bleed immune or because you have 0 genetic potential. So just be mindful of that, because that could, potentially confuse a lot of players if they're not getting those bleeds. And then finally, each hit of a special here gains a 50% chance to place a stagger passive on the opponent, lasting 10 seconds. The next time a staggered enemy triggers a buff, that buff will be immediately nullified. Sorry, I read that out of habit. So the specials are a little bit tricky as well. So special 1 will nullify 1 buff, and you will gain genetic potential if a buff is nullified, and you will immediately move into the next blessing. This is only really useful to use if you maybe already have 100% genetic potential, and you just started this phase, and you really want to nullify a buff. For the most part, you won't be using this ability that often. It's nice in situations such like Rage, where you want to keep their furies down, and there are specific use cases, so just be mindful that if you absolutely need to nullify an ability on the opponent, you can special 1 for a free nullify. But for the most part, special 2, after you've used a special 3, right? Symbiote Supreme is raised to special 3, but for the most part, after you've used a special 3, special 2 is where you're going to live, because the way special 2 works is depending on which phase, power, sword, or shield, you get a different effect from your special 2. So power phase, you have a 100% chance to seal 15% of the opponent's max power. Shield phase, you place a weakness debuff on the opponent, and sword phase, you armor break the opponent. So essentially, when you special 2, you want to make sure you're knowing that you're getting armor break, you're getting weakness. The weakness isn't super important unless you're running despair, so you do get some healing reduction as well stacked there, but you get power steal, armor break, and weakness when you special 2 and you have all 3 of these phases active. Now you might say, well, how do I have all 3 phases active? After you've raced to your special 3, you have a 100% chance to reset the genetic blessing timer and activate all 3 genetic blessings. So essentially, you race to special 3, immediately activate all 3 blessings, and then you want to ramp up to a special 2, special 2, special 2, and then recycle. And that's really how you play Symbiote Supreme. It's not too tricky, of a playstyle. It's just about knowing what you're getting out of him as a result. And the nice thing about this is once you've raced up to a special 2, and in the process of racing up to a special 2, you can actually push the opponent into a special 3 and then power drain them immediately, so you're not having to worry about tanking that special 3. And if you botch up after you special 3, you have that nice protection buff from shield phase as well. So some general tips on this guy is Mystic Dispersion, Mystic Dispersion, Mystic Dispersion. So the reason I emphasize that so much is the lack of natural power gain on this champion is what makes him feel so slow. He is very much so a ramp champion that if you never ramped up, you don't get a lot of value out of. But Mystic Dispersion is going to change the ramp from very slow to incredibly fast. And Mystic Dispersion 3 to 5 is where you want to live. And the reason for that is if I actually go to Mystic Dispersion here, I'll explain it as I go. So on the first point, you get 2% of power gain. On the second point, you get an additional 1%. The third point, you get an additional 2%. On the fourth point, you get an additional 3%. And on the fifth point, you get an additional 4%. So you can see how that first point is nice. That second point feels bad. The third point, it goes back to being a normal gain. The fourth point, you get even more value. And the fifth point, you get even more value. You can see here I'm running 3 because Mystic Dispersion is insanely expensive. But by the end of all those gains, you end up with 12 12% power gain every time you nullify a buff. And so a max Mystic Dispersion Symbiote Supreme, he can ramp up so quick against champions with buffs. It's absolutely insane. You can live in that infinite special 2 streak, infinite special 3 streak, and it feels really, really good. So that said, this is where you can see my 2%, right? So I got to 2%. That's just your initial gain. There's only a 1% difference here, only a 2% difference here, only a 3% difference here, and only a 4% difference here. And you do technically get diminished returns, but because this is gaining power and it's affecting your ability to ramp up and stay in high power levels, you know, really running max Mystic Dispersions is a huge difference than even running 3, right? Like there's still a 7% difference here just in these 2 points. So if you really, really, really love the guy and you're trying to like main him, max Mystic Dispersion is what you're looking for. Just, you know, it's several thousand units, so be ready to cough up the units if you're looking for it. If you're looking to do it on a budget, my advice is to get up to 3 points in Mystic Dispersion and then, I don't know, stall it off until you're ready to cringe and drop 1,200 units on Mystic Dispersion 4, an additional 1,800 units for Mystic Dispersion 5. So that said, that's really the champion. My tip for how to play him is essentially start the fight, pummel into your opponent, do full 5 combos. Then once you switch into shield phase, you want to switch to parry 2-hit combos or maybe parry heavy combos. And by the time you've switched into sword phase, you should be pretty close to a special 3. If you're not running Mystic Dispersion, you might not have a special 3 yet. So maybe go, you know, just bait out specials. And once you've baited out the specials, just kind of play around, pummel into them, get some bleeds, and then by the time you've done one more rotation or one more phase into like power phase here, then you can special 3 and beat the opponent that way. So I do have a video here that I will show you, but first let me just show you all of the phase icons as well as the protection buff, just so you know what you're looking for. And one big tip here is when you special 3, you want to make sure you have genetic potential stacked, because genetic potential causes you to switch into all 3 phases. Sorry, special 3 causes you to switch into all 3 phases simultaneously. So if you have, like, let's say 100% genetic potential already, you're gonna get a full bar of power immediately coming out of your special 3, which is huge. And it's super important that you wait for that genetic potential. There's no harm in holding your special 3 for just a little bit longer and making sure you get that 1 bar of power, because it's gonna help you get to that special 2 that much faster. So you can see here, this buff here, this first one here in the top left, this is Cthulhu's Cunning, and there's a passive timer on it ticking over the course of 15 seconds, showing you when it's ticking down. This next buff here is Genetic Potential, and you can see here, because I'm going up against Silver Surfer and I immediately nullified a buff right at the start of a fight, I'm already starting with 75. So let me skip ahead to the phase change. On this phase change here, you can see that this is shield phase or null shadow, and this is the protection buff. And if you actually watch, you can see that the timers are different. The protection buff, which only lasts for 2/3 of the phase window, drops a lot faster. So by the end of the phase or the end of the blessing, the last 5 seconds, it's actually gone. And then again, moving into here, I special 3 and trigger all 3. So this is his special. That's neat. We're just trying to skip and show you this quick as possible. You can see I get the Fury buff immediately after special 3. I get the Prop buff immediately after special 3. And this last icon here, this purple one in the top left, that is Set's Fangs. That's the buff that's going to, the blessing that's going to let you get bleeds on hit. And you can see immediately after special 3, I'm already at 100 genetic potential, and I'm going to absolutely pummel into this guy, getting a bleed on every hit. You can see even 4 bleeds is doing like 1,000 damage a second, and it's absolutely a great time. This guy's taking so much damage from me even playing passive. I don't really play the greatest here, but I move into a special 2. You can see armor break, and I'm already at a special 3 just from the nullifies as well as the special 2. And I'm going to immediately special 3, and that's going to kill him just because the armor breaks have him really weakened, and well, a rank 2 6-star does some work. So from a play standpoint, just kind of repeating myself, nothing too crazy, you know, start the fight, pummel into the opponent. Next phase, parry double mediums. Next phase, hopefully you already have a special 3, so you're just ramping genetic potential until you have 75 or 100% of genetic potential. And then use special 3. If you don't have a special 3 yet, next phase is just a regular phase. Bait specials, play it slow, and then you'll special 3. And then you'll build up to a special 2 spam until all of your blessings drop, and then you will immediately special 3 again. If you're bringing this guy to buffed champions, you will be able to spam special 2 and then almost immediately special 3 when your blessings drop. Just make sure that you're mindful of your blessings every time you special 2 and that you stack a special 3, and there's nothing wrong with doing like a special 2 and then a special 3 and just doing that kind of a rotation and just ensuring that you have your buffs up as long as possible, permanently stay blessinged up. That said, that's Symbiote Supreme. Sorry for the long talk through. It always is. Hopefully you got some value out of this, and I will talk to you all later.